First of all, can I say Happy New Year? This is our first webinar of 2018, and also it gives me very great pleasure indeed to welcome Helen, who I've worked with and known for a long time, and really looking forward to today's session. So Helen, you're very welcome to join us at the CRA. Couple of things to say, and that is that Helen will do her presentation, and while she's doing it, I would ask you to turn your microphones off so that we won't get interruptions. And then towards the end, there'll be time for questions and a discussion. So without further ado, it gives me very great pleasure to introduce Helen, who will tell us what she's been up to. Helen, the floor is yours. Helen, I can't hear you.
You know what? I've been chatting away and I was muted. So can you hear me now?
Yes, very clearly. Brilliant.
Fantastic. Good. Sorry about that. I was doing a lovely introduction to myself, but just talking to myself. Can you see me at all? Because I switched my video on.
We can see you very clearly.
Okay. I might be a strange shade of green, but I'm not quite sure why that is. But
you are indeed
anyway.
A very strange shade of green, but we won't comment.
Thank you, Steve. So as I said, welcome to this webinar, which is going to be on expertise as a model for professional learning in higher education. I'm Helen King, as Steve said, and I'm currently Associate Director of Academic Practice at the University of West of England, Bristol. I've been here for about 4 weeks, and prior to that, I worked for HEFGE, University of Bath, Higher Education Academy, and a whole range of other folks. My main area of work is in educational development. So what I'm hoping to do today in our hour that we've got here is try and get, ooh, there we go. So the other thing we've discovered is that Prezi doesn't work in full screen mode within GoToMeeting. So I've got to try and figure out how it's going to work in editing mode. So there we go. Hopefully you can just about see what I'm hoping we're going to get out of today. So what I'm going to talk about is one possible model for professional learning, but specifically within the context of higher education and teaching in higher education. And we'll have a think about how we might use that model. Is it just an interesting thing, or is there actual practical uses for it? And I hope it'll also give you a chance to reflect on your own approach to professional learning. Now, Steve did say that it's kind of going to be talking and then questions, but actually I'd like to be a little bit more interactive throughout the hour. But I appreciate that it is lunchtime and you may be wanting to get on with your lunch. So what we'll do is we'll do some interaction via the chat box. And there's only a small number of us, so hopefully that shouldn't be too bad. On my screen, the chat box is incredibly small, so I may have to kind of peer at it a little bit closely, even with my glasses on. But hopefully you'll be able to interact through that. So the first thing I'd like to do before I get started, I've got a list of your names and institutions, but it'd be really nice to know a little bit more about you. So if you could just type what your role is, either job title or what you think your main area of practice is. So we've got Beck, who's education developer. Hi, Beck. And Paul is deputy head of academic practice. And Lynn is e-portfolio coordinator. I can just about read it if I peer in. So I think between us, we've all got sort of a general interest in academic practice and educational development, all coming from roughly the same area. So I hope that we can find some sort of commonality in ideas. So I just want to give you a brief introduction into why I'm interested in expertise. I'm just going to move that out of the way. This would have worked perfectly if it's in full presentation mode. But one of the joys of academic development is who knows what's going to happen. So Over the years, I've worked in, I started my work in geoscience education and education development in the earth sciences. And through this, I got very interested in ways of thinking and practicing in the disciplines. So particularly things like threshold concepts, signature pedagogies, decoding the disciplines, if you're familiar with those things. Really interested in how different disciplines think, work, view the world. And this animation again won't work because I'm editing those, so I'll just move these out of the way. And that led me to an interest in characteristics of expert performance. And there's been a lot of work that's been done on this in a range of fields, from arts, surgery, athletics, chess, management, various different fields. And there are generally some commonalities in characteristics of expertise. So I began thinking as an education developer, well, what might be the characteristics of expert teachers in higher education? So as a starting point, I'm looking at how expertise is developed and maintained, which is going to be the topic of our webinar today. But there are many other characteristics of expertise. And I suppose ultimately, I'm particularly interested in expertise as perhaps a different discourse to excellence, because expertise is very much a process, and it's about bettering yourself and surpassing yourself. Whereas for me, excellence is a bit more of a kind of a static state that you reach, and is about being better than other people. So as an education developer, the notion of expertise, I think, sits better with my values in terms of how I'd like to work with people. So that was a quick introduction. Before I do the model, however, I'd like you to have a little think about how you develop and maintain your own practice. So we're just looking at the first two questions there. First of all, what things might cause you to change an aspect of your practice? So that might be a little change or a big change or trying something new. So if you could have a think about that and just type a couple of words in a chat box or sentence, doesn't need too much, whatever comes to mind. What things cause you to change your practice? Okay, so you've got a really interesting range of ideas though. So some of it is about seeing something else that's inspiring or gaining new evidence of something, experiencing something different, some problems, something maybe not working very well. So a range of things that make you sort of stop and think, I need to change. So the next question is, who might instigate or facilitate that change? So what person has agency in that? Okay, so we've got some great answers there. So we've got colleagues, we've got line manager, and also myself. That's a whole range of people that are involved in that. So thanks very much for that. We'll come back to it a little bit later, and we'll see how that might fit into the model. Okay, so you can sit back for a minute, and I'll present this one particular model that I'm looking at. So this is based on a model of expertise that was developed by Bloom, so same Bloom as in Bloom's taxonomy, particularly looking at talent in younger people. And then Ericsson built on this. Anders Ericsson has done a huge amount of work on expertise and characteristics of expertise. And then I've thrown in a little bit in there as well. though not yet written it up. So I'm just going to go through this, and in the first instance, I'm going to talk about it in the context of music. So I'm going to use that as an analogy to try and explain the different stages. And then after that, we'll talk together about how it might map on to teaching in higher education. So the first stage of acquiring and developing expertise, if you think about music, that often happens at a very young age. So you're likely to be sort of a child. It's likely to be quite playful and regular. So in my case, I was the youngest of 4 siblings, all of whom played musical instruments, and we had a piano in the house. So I just kind of sat there and bashed away at the piano, did it quite regularly because it was fun. I perhaps had a little bit of guidance from my parents and my siblings. And of course, I made rapid progress because I went from the point of not being able to do it to being able to sort of get some sort of noise. So there was very much that kind of experiential, playful mode. The next stage of learning is much more intensive. And this is where it's much more structured, guided, and there might be high expectations. So in my case, I had music lessons. So I had a teacher who gave me guidance, gave me feedback. There were expectations about what I should be able to do by the next lesson, how much practice I should be doing, and also clear goals in terms of what I was supposed to be achieving. And in my case, I went through the exam grades so I could see the progress there. And then really in terms of my piano playing, I'm kind of now at that experience stage. So I play for pleasure. I've been playing since I was 4 years old, so that's over 40 years. Lots of experience, lots of hours. But I'm not really getting any better, and I'm not any better now than I was at 17. But I really enjoy it. And I probably do learn a little bit. If I'm playing a new piece, I can learn to play a new piece. But generally, I'm not getting better. And if I'm playing a piece that I know quite well, I tend to skip over the tricky bits. But I still get a lot of pleasure from it. So I'm now going to talk about the expert characteristics and go into this a little bit more detail. So expert learning. So if we think about maybe a concert pianist, or for a different analogy, maybe an elite athlete, somebody like that, their learning is very committed. They're quite self-determined and self-regulated. And so their learning is much more explicit, whereas mine was quite tacit as an experienced pianist. They're very much thinking about their learning and their development, and they're seeking feedback. So they may continue to have a coach or a teacher or somebody that they can get to give them feedback and guidance. And Erickson termed this approach deliberate practice. Every now and again in the media, there's something around it takes 10,000 hours of practice to become an expert. And that always annoys me because that is true to an extent, in a broad sense. That's not the exact number, but it's true in a broad sense, but it's very particular practice. I've done many, many hours on the piano, but I'm by no means an expert pianist. It's this deliberate practice that's the key. And this is very, very focused. It's focusing on those bits that perhaps you don't do so well. Requires feedback, either from yourself through listening and feeling how it feels, or perhaps from others, a teacher or your audience. It requires a lot of time and also a lot of self-motivation, because at times it can be quite boring doing that kind of work. But as Erickson has found, research across domains, so across a range of different fields, shows that it's only by working at what you can't do that you turn into the expert you want to become. The other characteristic of, another way of thinking about that type of expert learning is the notion of progressive problem solving. So expertise might be thought of as a process of progressive problem solving in which people continuously rethink and redefine their tasks. And here the difference between experienced and expert is experienced people often have very learned patterns and procedures, which is a really good thing because that gives us efficiency. It's an intelligent way of behaving. So if you think about learning to drive a car, you're very experienced in that, and it makes you efficient. You don't have to kind of think through every step of the time. So often it's quite routine and automatic. The difficulty with that is that potentially you can get stuck in a rut. And this is obviously sometimes due to the fact that when you come up against new problems, you're trying to solve them using those same patterns, and it doesn't necessarily work. So you just keep on doing these things the same way. So the classic example is kind of the fly against the windows, just keeps flying against it, trying to get that, use that as a solution because it worked once, but it's still not working. So progressive problem solving is about doing things better, doing better things, and potentially it's about innovating as well. And one of the key things about both of these ways of thinking about expert learning is that it's very much about a process. So actually, you can use an expert process of learning without necessarily performing at an expert level, because there are many other characteristics of expertise beyond just how you learn. And this is something I've tried for myself. So when I got this job, I thought I would reward myself by buying myself a banjo, because I love the banjo and I always wanted to give it a go. I thought, great, this is a good opportunity for me to kind of practice what I preach and see if I can learn to play it in a different sort of way. So previously, if I picked up a new instrument, I've figured it out a little bit, but I've never really focused much on my learning. I just played a few tunes and then kind of didn't really go anywhere with it. But with the banjo, I've tried to be a bit more deliberate with it and to focus my practice. So if there are bits I'm stuck on, I work on them rather than just skipping over. Now, I've only had it for a few months. I'm certainly not expecting to become an expert performer, but I have noticed that I'm progressing more rapidly than I did through my kind of previous methods. So I could certainly get in kind of more fun out of it. So that's the expert learning. And then Erikson also contributed to this model with the idea of eminence, which is where you actually give back to the field. So an example from music, my eldest brother is a professional musician. He plays early music harp. And he now also researches into early music and also coaches people, does teaching and runs workshops and so on. So there's a whole stage there of learning where actually using your learning to support others through teaching and research. So that's the model. Are there any areas that are perhaps not clear or any questions that you might have on that before we have a look at how we might use it? There's nothing coming up in the chat box. Oh, no, Beck's got one. Okay, so it's a bit more about what makes deliberate practice. And Steve's asked about the importance of having a teacher for progression. So I'll just answer Steve's question first, because that's kind of that sort of progression bit, and then we get into the expertise. So having a teacher, I think, is important for progression because it particularly it gives you some structure to your learning, but in particular it gives you that it's an opportunity for feedback. I think it is possible to become elite or expert without having a sort of actual formal structured lessons, but I think it's highly unlikely that you'll be able to do that entirely in isolation of other people, and you need some sort of guidance from someone. You may not call them a teacher, but someone else who's giving you that feedback. So however we conceptualize the idea of a teacher, personally, I think it is important that you have someone else there to give you that feedback. In terms of deliberate practice, so what makes deliberate practice? So it's very much about being focused. So again, to use a music analogy, rather than just playing the same thing again and again, I very much focus on the bits that are particularly difficult or the things I can't do. So one example from perhaps my own work, rather than thinking about the music, if I'm doing something, so for example, let's take this webinar, for example. What I could have done previously, in fact, what I would have done previously, is just kind of throw it together, think, yeah, this is what I want to say, and we'll just kind of put it in a presentation and that'll be it. But I very much wanted to improve the way I do things. So I very deliberately focused on it. I spent a lot more time on it, thinking about what do I really want to get out of it, what might be the problems that might work, might not work, both in terms of technology and the format in that you're remote from me. And then, so it was very much kind of focusing on what I was trying to get out of it and what might be best to do that. The feedback side of that, that had to be kind of self-feedback and self-reflection. But I'm hoping that you'll give me some feedback at the end of this as well, so I can learn for the next time. And I did have to be very motivated, because it would be quite easy just to throw this together really quickly. But actually, I really wanted to make sure that it was perhaps better than I might have done previously. So those are the four elements. It's about being focused, taking the time, getting feedback, and then having that motivation. Does that make it any clearer? Okay, so I think what we can do is, if we now have a think, if we go back to those original questions about how you develop and maintain your own practice. So I talked a little bit about how I used the idea of deliberate practice, of kind of that focused reflection, if you like, focused practice on developing this webinar. Are there different ways that you might now think about your own approaches to learning and development? Now you've seen that model. It may not be. I think some of the things that you were saying earlier about things that cause you to change your practice, if something not working, you then need to look at it. The people that are instigating that's yourself, it's giving you that motivation, but you're getting that facilitation from colleagues, sort of who act as buddies or mentors to give you feedback. In some cases, you might have your line manager to give you feedback and that motivation as well. Are there any other thoughts about your own learning and development? Well, we'll kind of keep on reflecting on that. And what we'll do now is, if we can kind of do this together, is having a look at how this model of expertise might relate to teaching in higher education. Now, obviously, well, I would imagine that most people aren't thinking about being a higher education teacher when they're very, very young. So this model is perhaps kind of shifted in age, if you like. So we're going from, rather than sort of development from a child, we're looking at development from a novice to an expert or eminent. And what does that look like in the context of teaching in higher education? So this playful side of it, so this is when you're new, you're novice, you're doing something quite regularly, so you make rapid progress from not being able to do something to being able to do something. And it might be quite experiential, possibly with a little bit of informal advice and guidance. So what sort of stage do you see this being in teaching in higher education? Do you think does this make sense at any point? Any comments before I throw in my ideas? I'm assuming, because nothing's coming up in the chat box, you're kind of thinking this through. So if anything pops into your head, do type it into the box, and I'll kind of talk through where I think this might fit. So I think this is very much, if you're a new lecturer or perhaps a graduate teaching assistant, and you probably haven't quite yet had an opportunity to have any formal development, often you get thrown in at the deep end. So the advantage of being in edit mode for Prezi is I can make some notes as we go. So you might have a buddy or a mentor possibly, but you're really kind of doing that real learning by experience. The next stage, I think, is probably more analogous to if you're on probation. You might have academic probation, you might have particular expectations of you in terms of your teaching, perhaps in terms of student feedback that you might get. In some institutions, you might also be required to take a formal course, like a PG Cert, or perhaps an accredited course. And in both of those cases, there are going to be, hopefully, clear goals and expectations that you meet those goals. And then the learning will be guided and structured. So particularly if you're on a course, that's a sort of classic example really of that guided learning, intensive learning. So you'll have your educational developers teach you on that course. You may have a tutor or a buddy. And of course, you'll also have your colleagues on the course that you can learn from as well. And so your learning about teaching and learning to teach is very much led by that course. But also, you've still got that experiential learning because, of course, it's learning, it's work-based learning as you go. So if you think of that analogy with the music again, it's not a theoretical thing, it's very linked into theory and practice. So you've got learning by experience, plus also learning from other people and through having clear goals and structure. The experience side of things. Now for me, this is where you may or may not have done a course, you've perhaps been teaching for a large number of years. You do still respond to feedback, but you might not be making such sort of innovations as other people. And sometimes you might get stuck in a rut, not necessarily, but in some cases. So one example that springs to mind was I was doing a peer observation with a colleague who has continually been receiving negative feedback from students and wasn't really doing anything about it. So I went along to observe them, and they only had a class of 8 final year students, so it was kind of a real opportunity to do something very interactive with the students and something kind of very meaningful to their own context. The teacher, however, was teaching in the same way that they'd done for many, many years, and couldn't really see how to do things differently. They'd written their lecture notes, and they sort of thought, well, how am I going to do it differently? They kind of very much got stuck in that rut. And they saw that the problem wasn't theirs, that it was the students. Well, obviously the students, they're no good, they can't do this. So there was a real blockage there, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and I just want to share another quote with you in a minute. But of course, not everybody's like that who's got that experience. But what you're not seeing is that kind of progressive problem solving, that changing of practice, that active responding to feedback. So this is the bit I would really like your feedback and ideas on, if you can. So what does an expert teacher look like? So a teacher that uses these approaches to learn deliberate practice or progressive problem solving. what sort of characteristics might we expect to see in terms of how they change and develop their practice? Is there anything that springs to mind? Okay, well, maybe we can come back to that once. We'll probably switch microphones on in a short while so we can have a chance to feed in kind of verbally, which might help. So in terms of this kind of deliberate practice, so I gave the example for myself in terms of developing a webinar, but I think a lot of us already do this in terms of responding to student feedback and some of the things that you mentioned already, learning from others' practice, learning from the evidence that we read in the literature, and also through sort of guidance and discussion with colleagues. And that takes time to engage with that. You need to be quite committed and self-motivated to think about, well, how am I going to develop my course? Or what type of different activities am I going to do? How am I going to respond to my learners? How am I going to ensure that they are learning? And it's very easy just to kind of deliver your teaching without thinking about the learners. But when we start thinking about the learners, we start thinking about our teaching and how we can progress that and change it. And I'm sure many people have had experience of teaching one cohort of students in one way and it being fantastic and working really well. And then the next time do the same thing with a different cohort and it just doesn't work. And being able to adjust to that as you go and identify, well, where are the sticking points, where are the problems here, and progressively developing it. I think that's a kind of the examples of kind of expert practice and teaching. So the last quote I just wanted to share was from John Dewey, who said that the path of least resistance and least trouble is a mental rut already made. It requires troublesome work to undertake the alternation of old beliefs. I think this is a lovely quote in reference to things like threshold concepts, but it also really fits that kind of experience versus expertise sort of spectrum. So actually it's very easy just to keep on doing the same old things. And actually it does take quite a bit of work to change things and to believe that actually maybe doing something in a different way might be more effective. Okay, so I'm not going to type in there because hopefully I'll talk through that clearly enough. So how are we doing on time? We've got 20 minutes. So the last thing I wanted to look at was thinking about how we might use this model. But before I go on to that, did that make sense in terms of how I was mapping that model onto teaching in higher education? Do you think it's relevant to teaching in higher education, or is perhaps maybe a different type of model might be appropriate? Do you think we can use expertise as a way of thinking about how we learn to teach? Thumbs ups or smileys or thumbs downs, or I think it would be great just to get a bit of feedback. Okay, now I need to make a big apology here because for some reason in my chat box it wasn't scrolling down, so I wasn't seeing all your new comments that were coming in. So I'm just coming back, as you can see, I'm now leaning forward and going back for. So what I'm going to do after the webinar, I'm going to go back and look at those comments, and then I can feed back to you as well and kind of share them. So I do apologise for that. It's a new learning experience for me in terms of using GoToMeeting. Okay, but it's looking positive that you think there are some useful things we can do here. I think it's a really interesting point there that Paul makes about changing practice, that there isn't chance to practice, if you like, in that we can't sort of, I assume by that, you know, we don't get a chance to repeat things again and again. It's kind of not the same as playing the piano, where I can just spend time on my own doing something, and I know that that will make a difference. Teaching, I think, is your practice is much more exposed because it happens whilst you're performing, if you like. But I think that notion of focusing on developing the task can help with that. Okay. Great. Well, it's good to see that you've got some positive thoughts there. So what I just quickly want to do, and then we'll let you switch on the microphones because it'd be lovely to hear your voices. I've come up with a few ideas about how to use the model. And I think a couple of them you've come up with in the chat box as well. So for me, I found it really useful to think about my own learning and development, and to think about the role that formal learning, so courses and so on, the role that has to play alongside my own learning, and how I might structure my learning and making things better in terms of my practice, and maybe getting the most out of experiences. I think it'd also be useful for supporting and motivating others to think about their own professional learning and development. The model we often use in higher education is reflective practice. And I think this is very similar. I think it's perhaps maybe a different side of the same coin, or perhaps it's exactly the same thing, but using different terminology and different sort of conceptual basis. And when I've talked about this before, a few people have said that actually they think that maybe the notion of expertise and deliberate practice might resonate better with some people than the notion of reflective practice. So it might be kind of a complementary tool that we can use to help people think about developing their teaching. I think that kind of progression model, I mean, I think it's probably one that we use implicitly anyway, thinking about, well, how do we develop people when they're new, when they're novices? What different things do we do to support them as they become more experienced, more expert? And then how do we enable them to kind of feed back into that and support others? And so I think that's a kind of a familiar model anyway in terms of planning professional development. But then we've got that kind of expert learning model we can kind of sit on top of that. And I think also there's connections with other frameworks. So with the UK Professional Standards Framework, for example, the Senior Fellowship, Descriptive 3, is not just about being able to teach and support learning, but it's about supporting others and kind of contributing to the field. So maybe that's a little bit around that kind of eminent idea. Or maybe there's other frameworks, like academic promotions criteria. Perhaps there's something in there about, you know, we want to have ideas about how people develop, professionally develop their own practice, and how they give back, contribute back to teaching more broadly. And something that I'm hoping to do is to actually, so this is all kind of theoretical at the moment, but I'm really keen to actually interview some experienced or hopefully expert teachers and to see how they describe their own professional development. And I think that's particularly interesting for me because in terms of excellence models, so things like the National Teaching Fellowship Scheme, CPD, and also in the UK PSF, CPD is a key aspect seen as an important part of excellence. So I'm really keen to see, well, what does that actually look like in practice? How do people actually go about developing themselves? And can we use that as deliberate practice or progressive problem solving as a way of describing them? So that's my next step of having done quite a lot of talking to people about this, is actually trying to see how well the model actually matches. So I think that's probably everything for me. We've still got about 15-20 minutes or so. So very much like to open the floor to you. Again, if you want any further clarity, any questions or suggestions, perhaps about how you might use the model, it would be great to hear from you. So either again in the chat box, or if you'd like to speak, that'd be fantastic.
Colleagues, the floor is yours.
Either stunned silence or you're still eating your lunch. So there's a question from Beck about whether the people who suggested expertise that was more palatable to reflective practice share any reasons why. Yes, I think it was mostly because I think it was seen as perhaps more comfortable for people from a science background, this is being very stereotypical, but who felt that kind of reflection felt a bit too social sciencey, a bit too wishy-washy. This is not my thoughts, I'm just paraphrasing. But because deliberate practice is based on it's an empirical model, so there's a lot of evidence that's being developed in a range of fields. I think that's sometimes that sort of, it felt that might sit better, perhaps with more sort of people with sort of more science view, or just as an alternative way of conceptualizing reflection. So for some people where it didn't quite get it, deliberate practice was effectively the same thing, but just describing it in a different way. So there's two sort of things. For some people who just, you know, for whatever reason don't like reflective practice, they can use a different concept, or it's just an alternative way to try and get your head around the whole thing.
Thank you, that makes a lot of sense.
But again, as I said, I mean, it's a lot of this is just my thinking and kind of chatting to colleagues like through this webinar. So the next step for me is very much to explore this in practice. You know, does it actually work? Does deliberate practice and progressive problem solving expertise, is that more meaningful for some people? How well does it complement reflective practice?
Helen, you've got a question from Paul. To what extent do you feel that the stages of the model can or do overlap?
That's a great question. The problem about presenting the model like that, I'll just go back to it, risk of making me feel seasick on Prezi. Okay. The problem about presenting like this is it looks very linear, and I think it's much more complex than that. In the same way that with coal, you know, it's not really a circle; it's perhaps more of a spiral, or perhaps something even more complex. I think there's definitely overlapping, and you sort of go back to different stages at different times. So this idea of expertise being a process, I think sometimes, let's say I am an expert, let's say an expert pianist, whilst most of the time I'm very self-determined and very committed and so on, perhaps if I took on a new piece of music in a completely different genre, I might think actually I'm almost being a novice again. This is totally new. So in a sense, you might kind of go back to a previous stage. But kind of, it's that metacognition, I think, that being able to learn and acknowledge that. So although you might be having a more intensive learning experience, going back to the guided side, in a way you're still using expert processes because that's self-determined, and you've recognized that you need that support. So I think it very much kind of overlaps and interlinks, and it's not a level thing. You don't sort of do one or another. And I think it's possible to be doing those things at the level of eminence without necessarily being an expert, without having those characteristics. I'm sure there are some people out there who don't particularly learn from their own practice, but kind of bows things to others and try to support other people on the basis of their perceptions of experience. So I think it is very, it's not a linear thing at all.
Helen, one of the things you said you were going to do is to talk to people who are expert teachers, and I wonder whether you have thought through what are the criteria that you will be using to
Yeah,
define somebody as expert.
yes. That's the big problem with this, is that it's very much a catch-22, because in order to identify an expert, you need to know what your characteristics, what your criteria are. But you don't know what your criteria are until you've found an expert to identify it. So it's very much a loop. So what I'm hoping to do is I'm going to use National Teaching Fellowship as a proxy for expertise, just simply because these are people who've been recognised for excellence using a particular set of criteria, but one of which is their own CPD. So hopefully they'll already thought about CPD to an extent. So I think it's going to be an iterative process. So I'm going to kind of start with those people, so very much as a proxy for expertise, see what comes out of that, but also explore, see if perhaps I can identify some experienced people or talk to novices. I think it's something that's going to develop over time. See if we can then start identifying what the criteria for expertise are by identifying the experts. But yeah, that's a real problem with this type of research, and particularly in something like teaching, where I suppose in something like athletics, the criteria for elite is much clearer. You kind of you won the Olympics. That's fairly clear that you're probably an elite performer. It's not the same in teaching at all, and there can be some people who might be very much experts in terms of how they learn, but also whatever all the other characteristics of experts are, but who never out on the public stage, so we never know that they're there. So, yeah, it's an interesting one.
Thanks, Helen. Colleagues, any more questions, comments? Helen, I've got one. Oh, okay. We've got one come up. I really do like the use of expertise as a focus for development rather than excellence, which is a distracting term in my area, from Lynn. Thank you, Lynn.
Yeah. I mean that's one of the things that really got me interested in expertise. Actually, as I said right at the beginning, I think for me it feels a much nicer concept to be working with, particularly when you work in education development. Partly as well, not only is that kind of a values thing, but also we don't really know what excellence is. That's not particularly well defined either. At least the broad characteristics of expertise, there's some empirical models out there, or empirically based models, that also explore other characteristics, not just the learning side. But excellence is very much kind of self-defined. So yeah, so I think it's quite an interesting model to sort of work with it.
And I've got a thought which is disturbing me, which is looking at the model and your earlier mention of threshold concepts and signature pedagogies, and I wonder whether the model can make a contribution to pedagogic thinking. It stimulated me to think about areas of practice. So I thought of subjects where there's obvious areas of practice like sports sciences, and then got to thinking, is there any subject which doesn't have practice in it? The chemist doing research or the philosopher practicing thinking, in which case, as well as looking at the model to support teacher development, I wonder whether it can actually make a significant contribution to our pedagogic thinking, particularly around threshold concepts, which is still for me quite a nebulous area.
Yeah, I mean, personally think it's relevant for anything. So I think you could probably use this model to think about research. How do you do research if you're that chemist doing research? Well, how do you learn to do that research? How do you develop your research? How does that change? So I think in any discipline, any subject area, there is a practice. And I used to use the whole characteristics of expertise, there's a range of other things as well around pattern recognition, problem solving, and so on. And I used to talk about that in courses for new lecturers to help them to think about ways of thinking and practicing their disciplines. I describe it in the context of my subject area of geology. And there's been some research done there about ways of thinking and practicing that kind of fits into the expert model. So I was able to use that to talk about my subject area and say, well, if this is how an expert geologist thinks, if these are the characteristics of an expert geologist, what can we do in terms of our teaching and supporting learning to enable students to progress towards developing those characteristics? So I think very much it fits into all aspects of education development and pedagogy.
Thanks, Helen. People are thinking about having to go, so I'm just saying that yes, people will get a copy of the recording, and Kath usually gets those out almost immediately. Before people do disappear, because we're running out of time, first of all, to thank Helen for what was a marvellous, stimulating lunchtime session and kicked us off really well for the new year. So it's a difficult act to follow, but that's really, really good. It's got me thinking. So thank you very much for that. Clap, everybody. Virtual clap.
Thank you. Can I quickly say something as well? Thank you very much. It's a really nice opportunity to kind of share my ideas and get that feedback. If you want to contact me any time, there's my email addresses on the screen there. And also my website, I'm starting to develop, I'm hoping to start posting some ideas up there as well. It's relatively new, so there's not a lot there yet. But I very much welcome more feedback, discussion, if you'd like to get involved in developing this any further. But also, talking about learning experience, I'm actually using this, I'm actually on our PG CAP, our PG Cert, PCAP, because all new academics at the university are required to take it. So I said, well, I want to step up and do that. So which is a fantastic learning experience for me. So this webinar is actually being observed by my tutor, so I'll be getting feedback from her. So if you'd like to give me feedback on the webinar itself, that would be really helpful, because I'm also going to be doing something very similar for CEDA in March, so give me a good chance to kind of learn and develop for that. Thank you very much.
Colleagues, we will do that. Thank you, Helen. Before everybody goes, just a quick flyer that our second webinar is coming up on the 5th of February with Laurie Phipps from JISC, showing us the way around digital leadership. I'm sure Helen knows Laurie very well.
I do indeed.
And then on the 12th of